Tracy Dawson handles the welcoming and presentation introductions. Tracy's in Florida right now.
She didn't come back for this?
No, she wouldn't come back for this, so it's fallen upon me to do both parts this time. Well, no, but we are recommending next year for January and February that we have our meetings down in Florida and you all come down.
Oh, sounds good. Paid, right? The association pays our way down to the meeting?
Well, we're making it like a travel thing where everybody pays $500. It's a fundraiser for us also.
Oh, I see.
Okay. Just a few reminders for the evening, as we usually do. If you haven't done the sign-in sheet, we appreciate it. That's how we know that you would like to keep getting emails about these meetings. As usual, there's a contribution bucket over there that helps us pay for the small amount of rental that we do pay for this, as well as printing supplies and occasional pieces of equipment. There are also, should be enough, if there's not, you can pass some more around, evaluation forms. And we appreciate that you fill these out and maybe even think about doing it as we proceed through the meeting when you think of something. We'd like to know how successful we are, so there's a place to rate your satisfaction. We'd like to know how you heard about us. And we'd like to know if you have some other ideas for us for future meetings. So that's some of the reasons why we ask you to fill that out before you leave. Restroom location is down that corridor. It's a unisex restroom, so knock before you enter or lock it, whatever. I'm going to ask a question first. I'm going to ask this question, and that is, how many of you knew about transportation of the TPP before I sent out a notice about this meeting? Most of you were aware of the situation? Okay. And I want to share with you, we have attempted to make this a fair and balanced presentation. We're trying to get information from those that are proponents and those that are opponents. I have to tell you, I wanted to have a little video presentation, a video segment of both sides, and I spent a tremendous amount of time searching the internet for a presentation or a speech or an interview of someone who was speaking for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I could not find them, and I asked for help. I sent out help to every member of our committee saying, look, if you can, help me find something, and I couldn't. Now, I've drawn a conclusion from that, but I'm not going to share it with you. You can draw your own conclusion as to why there's nobody out there saying, we have to do this, we have to do this.
Except our representatives.
Pardon me?
Except our representatives in Congress.
Well, not even the representatives of Congress are speaking out on this a whole lot, as I'll tell you later. And in fact, there's a lot of members of Congress who don't even know very much about what's in the proposed trade agreement. Okay? You'll find on your table, there's a set in the center of materials. There's some there to share. And you find in that group a yellow sheet, or excuse me, there's a white sheet that's entitled Valid Resolution Urging Congress to Pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. That is one of our attempts at trying to get out the other side of the story. If you read through that, and I'm going to ask you to do that in a little while. There's a yellow sheet that's another from an organization called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S. Business Coalition for TPP, the yellow sheet, and that's another group that is for the U.S. agreeing or taking part in this trade agreement. There's a blue sheet that lists the coalition members, the corporations that are in this group and are in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a green sheet that lists many of the, at least a sampling of the organizations that oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So it is a very polarized issue. There are strong sentiments for it, and there are strong sentiments against it. That's the only things that I've given you on the table. I'm also going to share with you, I sent out a list of 3 questions to the Representative Heisinger, Senator Levin, and Senator Stabenow. And I'll find those, and there's a few of those on the table. I want to read you the questions that I asked them to respond to, and I sent those in for them in writing for them to respond and answer. And I also talked to representatives in each of their offices trying to get what positions are these representatives, these elected officials, have they taken on these actions. First question that I asked was, have you decided whether or not you will support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement? The second question I asked them was, will you support legislation to provide the President with fast-track authority for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? And the third question was, do you believe the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement should be consummated without the public being informed of the contents? Okay. I'm going to tell you the answers that I got. I'm going to just a quick summary of that. Senator Levin's office did not respond in writing, did not provide me with a statement that I can read to you tonight. They did tell me that he was against fast tracking and he hasn't decided on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Senator Stabenow has, in writing, responded that she is against the fast tracking authority legislation. I had really hoped to have a representative here from Representative Heisinger's office, or he himself come to the meeting. He's in Washington. I tried to get him to send his local representative from his office, and they both have indicated that they are unavailable for this evening. I sent them the 3 questions and have had no response from his office for those questions. So the only thing I can say about Representative Heisinger's response is no response. Okay? I can read you the written response that I received from Senator Stabenow. Says, thank you for contacting me about the so-called fast-track process for approving trade agreements. I share your deep concerns about the renewal of the President's Trade Promotion Authority. As you know, Trade Promotion Authority requires that Congress give trade agreements an up or down vote and forbids Congress from making changes to the agreement. I have consistently voted against Trade Promotion Authority bills because this process has not worked for our American middle class. Hard-working families across the nation have lost their jobs to countries that cheat the system, steal our intellectual property, and systematically block American products from entering their markets. Our trade agreements need to support American job opportunities and protect American innovation. It is also critical that trade partnerships are written in a way that allows Michigan to be competitive in the global economy. Please know that as proposals to renew Trade Promotion Authority are debated in the Senate, I will fight for fair trade that protects American workers and businesses and helps maintain a strong middle class. Thank you for contacting me. Please continue to keep me informed on issues of concern to you and your family. Okay? So she did respond in writing, not specifically to all the questions that I asked her. On your table, you'll find of the sheets that I put on each table, the one that is entitled ALEC resolutions urging Congress to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the white sheet. There should be one on each table. What I'd like you to do is either have a volunteer in your group who's willing to read that through to the rest of the group, or if you'd like, you can even read a portion and pass it on to someone else to do some of the reading. It's not all that long. And then take about 10 minutes or so to discuss your reaction to that position. This is an attempt to get the other side of the story out, because I could not find a video piece for you to watch on that. Okay? So if you'll do that, be thinking about where to find it. Think about whether you find yourself in agreement with those the reasons why the proposal is not.
Free market exchange to support negotiations.
Don't ask for TPP. Just free trade.
Multilateral trade framework. Currently,
Yeah, go ahead.
No, was that
whereas American legislative negotiations of policy on trade challenges both
The TPP is a multilateral trade framework Pacific nations for varying levels of development.
whereas
The agreement has flexibility to expand the members
that will increase trade
against future trade frameworks with our measures. Whereas the American Legislative and Exchange Council policy on free trade acknowledges the position of encourages
others likewise attracts to participations. And whereas
If I give you the chance, can you do the graphs and show dead weight loss and why tariffs are bad and why free trade works in the abstract?
Can I don't have any grants, but I can talk, I can certainly clarify it.
I mean, I'll warn you in advance, it's a little bit more nuanced than TPP. I understand and appreciate the argument in favor of free trade in general. We already have trade agreements with most countries that are already in the existing TPP or will be in this future.
whereas
Most of those are already so the argument for eliminating tariffs doesn't help support this thing if the tariffs are
and U.S. exports to Asia, whereas
So what direction is this for that area?
one of the things is to establish a tribunal to be used instead of national courts to resolve certain disputes. What can the tribunal be? You can say that Chinese companies invest in the United States. The United States passes the laws. We don't like some of the things that you're putting in our product. We want to regulate it on the basis of
I had to
the
stop
Chinese
others and I'm
government
thinking,
actually a Chinese
which
company.
part of
It
their,
used
yeah,
to
who's
be
in
government's owned.
and what part of your tax investment?
NAFTA, for example, not company itself. What is tribunal? He sued the United States and saying our expectation of
Yeah.
was based on being able to earn a certain rate of return in those accounts. And in the absence of that law is
The patina.
you ought to pay us.
Whereas
Because
successful conclusion of the TPP
Yeah.
negotiations will provide economic.
Of course, that's not gonna happen.
What's that?
We're not gonna pay.
Americans, workers, farmers, ranchers.
We don't, they never give up our sovereignty.
and small business.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, but if we adopt it, the thing we can handle it.
We're already subject to a number of bilateral investment treaties with a whole bunch of countries all over the world. Plus, there's an organization that's under the auspices of the World Bank, that they used to do this. But if a country, in relation to a particular investment in the country, agrees against an arbitration, the arbitrator can say, yeah, you pay money. The other country's got to pay.
Or intergovernment would be better than us having.
Just like happens when a judgment is entered against the federal government by the federal courts of the United States, that arbitral agreement should be enforceable by the U.S. courts as well. They can make the
I hope
and let's say hypothetically someone one of those arbitrations and the United States didn't pay. Financial markets all over the world would say, wow, the U.S. just defaulted for one of its
Yes, that's it, yeah.
hundreds
But
of years since the war.
whereas this can just throw all of those away to make it a good thing, the TPP.
No, there will be a tribunal, a transnational tribunal that handles some kinds of cases independent from the U.S. courts.
So we could be.
But not all cases.
Asian trade law calls the regional comprehensive economic.
The United States already can be.
The TPP
Well, I know,
will
yeah,
give
I know
the
why that
United
is.
States more engagement in the Asian economies. The Obama administration.
You may remember the Nicaragua versus U.S. case. The World Court is, that only deals with violations of international law.
In the United States.
This would create new ways of going after the United States or going after virtually any country that's in the Soviet Union.
The TPP, they won't. The TPP will be an impetus for.
It is.
Well, it's still a negotiation.
Multilateral.
Yeah.
Now, not every individual would be subject to the
No, but I think
jurisdiction.
that if you,
Bilateral and multilateral.
yeah, I would have
For
said
the benefit of the United States.
someone probably would be fair.
Now, be it reasonable.
That happens all the time. I'm going to give you an example. When I got up and talked about the tuna dolphin case, for example, the tuna dolphin case, but you'll find a false negative.
I didn't understand your words. To the dolphin.
Tuna dolphin, okay. The United States lost that the domestic miracle action.
Yeah, but the import case hold up right now. Are we not where we can actually lost?
Right now, we're paying millions of dollars.
We might be involved in court that actually hold any.
Right now, we're paying Brazil millions of dollars a year to protect our sheep farmers.
Well, or let me give you an example on another thing. This is a World Trade Organization tribunal. The United States decided to pass a regulation to limit the ability of internet gambling companies to transact business with U.S. customs.
Well, you can probably explain it better than you guys. It's only your voice.
The federal government ought to have that power. Sure, prohibits some kinds of activities.
I don't think it ought to exercise it. I think it ought to have it.
Developing model legislation.
That went to a tribunal in front of the WTO.
And
WTO said, yeah, that's a violation of free trade. The United States has violated free trade, and the
that
remedy
is to the benefit of huge corporations and
is the negative certain amount of the United States intellectual property.
So that's
And for that, so $60 billion a year, they just get to freely hire this intellectual property.
That means that the case was not, we were regulating internet gambling, and they were regulating all sports.
they refer to the United States as almost a monolithic block of,
And they already paid for it.
but no, we're not
We
going
are
to
regulating all of it.
we have a lot of 95%.
Aren't we allowed to regulate it all?
Them, us.
We can discriminate somewhat, just as long as you don't violate certain fundamentals.
Yeah, how you doing anyway? Not so bad, it's good to see you again.
We were regulating
My signature doing
not
it good,
just
being that
gambling
I'm way up there.
in the United States,
More would do good
affecting U.S. citizens, but also offshore gambling.
when it gets warmer, is to recruit people to.
But the regulation was the same for them as it was for their.
We got some time. I've been on second signatures every weekend, so Saturdays or something. That's all I'm doing. So I'm doing fine. I'm ahead of schedule, but I got 10 people that already want to do it. I just ain't gonna send nobody else.
Sure enough. And you still stay in touch with Matt? I'm talking about Matt.
Yeah, no, I haven't really talked to anybody right now. I'm just concentrating on this, and I don't know whether it's even going to go anywhere. I mean, there's some people that pissed off at me for running.
Troublemaker.
You know what the problem is? That it guarantees one person.
It guarantees what?
It'll probably guarantee a couple.
Oh, I got you, yeah.
So, I mean, I don't see a difference between any of them. They're all about the great things. I don't know how you feel about it, but both parties.
So I'm screwed. I tell you what I think, man. I know you're genuine, you know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I don't trust most people. They're in it for themselves. They don't want to be talking about it, you know what I mean? But I got faith in you. And that's what I mean. It's just that
Now, if you can, you know, or if you want to ride around and get signatures, or,
Yeah.
but you just gotta, I have a map where you can get them. It's the whole outer perimeter, basically. So, anybody wants to do it, they can help.
let's do that. Let's do that. It's possible. I just dropped man off. He's visiting a guy and friend at the old folks. Oh, yeah.
Let's get together and we got some time. We got 180 days.
Right, okay. They go by in a hurry, though, don't they?
One of the things that this Elliot does is it does the conferences and senators and for them if they want to do they will literally they have their they will write the legislation, they'll get it all worked out, and they'll say, how much we got it all done for you. Scan over it, you don't worry about it, it's got everything.
I think that was a 10-minute time.
We haven't wrote any of that.
Okay, I'm going to call us back to our work. That's the next thing. I'd like to ask you to do this too. You've heard the 3 questions that I asked the Congress people. I'm going to read those again and ask that as we proceed through the presentation, the discussion that we just had in the video, and then the discussion that Eric will moderate in a little while, that you keep those questions in mind for yourself. And the questions are, again, have you decided whether or not you will support the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? Were you a representative of the people? Would you support the legislation to provide the President with fast-track authority? And do you believe the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, should be consummated without the public being informed of the contents? Yeah, answering those questions for yourself. Proceed through this. I'd like to welcome back for the evening Eric Grimm, who, as some of you will remember, moderated for us a discussion on drone warfare. He did a fantastic job. Everybody was very supportive of the way he handled that. Eric practices law in several areas, including intellectual property and internet law. Both of those issues, I think you will see as we proceed through this, are issues that some are very concerned about with regard to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Eric is also a councilman, right, with North Shores. Roosevelt Park, excuse me.
North Shores is a club.
Okay. Also, as we proceed through this, I'd like you to be thinking of, education is a wonderful thing. We're glad to hold these meetings and be talking to you or helping people understand some of the relevant issues, serious issues that we're facing as in our society. But education without action doesn't mean a whole lot. So I'd like you to be thinking throughout the time that we're doing this presentation, what is it that we might be able to do as a group, or that you might be able to do as an individual as a result of the knowledge that you obtained this evening. Okay? And maybe share that at the end. Ask you to report on your thoughts or your group's thoughts on that. So I guess with that, I'm just going to introduce first. I've introduced Eric. Now I think we're going to watch this this video here, and someone will deal with a couple of the lights over there.
I get the lights.
Yeah.
This is Democracy Now!, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Not quite.
President Obama announced this week that the U.S. government shutdown would delay his upcoming 4-country trip to Asia, but that negotiations on a controversial new trade agreement he hopes to sign by the end of the year will continue to move forward. Obama called the Philippines president Tuesday night to say he would miss his visit, and a spokesperson shared the news with reporters Thursday.
Tuloy yung visit ni Secretary Kerry dito. He will go in place of President Obama. President Obama personally called President Aquino to explain to him why he could not make the visit.
John Kerry will attend Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation meetings next week in Indonesia, where he'll push for the completion of a sweeping new trade deal called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the largest international trade deal since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. The administration hopes to pass the measure through Congress by the end of the year, using its fast-track authority to limit lawmakers to an up or down vote.
The TPP is often referred to by critics as NAFTA on steroids, and would establishing a free trade zone that would stretch from Vietnam to Chile, encompass 800 million people, about a third of world trade and nearly 40% of the global economy. While the text of the treaty has been largely negotiated behind closed doors, more than 600 corporate advisors reportedly have access to the measure, including employees of Halliburton and Monsanto. Well, for more, we're joined by Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Lori, welcome back to Democracy Now! Just explain what the TPP is.
Well, one of the most important things to understand is it's not really mainly about trade. I guess the way to think about it is as a corporate Trojan horse. The agreement has 29 chapters, and only 5 of them have to do with trade. The other 24 chapters either handcuff our domestic governments, limiting food safety, environmental standards, financial regulation, energy and climate policy, or establishing new powers for corporations. For instance, there are the same investor privileges that promote job offshoring to lower wage countries. There is a ban on buy local procurement so that corporations have a right to do sourcing, basically taking our tax dollars and instead of investing them in our local economies, sending them offshore. There are new rights to, for instance, have freedom to enter other countries and take natural resources, a right for mining, a right for oil, gas, without approval. And then there's a whole set of very worrisome issues relating to internet freedom. Through sort of the back door of the copyright chapter of TPP is a whole chunk of SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, that activism around the country successfully derailed a year ago. Think about all the things that it would be really hard to get into effect as a corporation in public. A lot of them rejected here and in the other 11 countries, and that is what's bundled in to the TPP. And every country would be required to change its laws domestically to meet these rules. The binding provision is each country shall ensure the conformity of domestic laws, regulations, and procedures. Now, the only reason I know that level of detail is because a few texts have leaked, and I have been following the negotiations and grilling negotiators from other countries to try and find between the lines what the hell is going on. Otherwise, totally secret.
Well, Lori, about that secrecy, even members of Congress have been severely limited in what they can learn, and that's only after the revelations about the total secrecy that this whole process began with. Could you talk about what members of Congress are allowed to know and how?
Well, what's really important for people to know, and this gets to what you started out with about fast track, Congress has exclusive constitutional authority over trade. It's kind of like the Boston Tea Party hangover. After having a king just impose tariffs, in that case on tea, the founders said, we need to put all things about trade, international commerce, in the hands of Congress, the most diffuse part of the elected representation, not the executive, the king. So Congress has all this authority. They're supposed to be exclusively in control, but until this June, they were not even allowed to see the draft text. And it was only after a big, great fuss was kicked up by a lot of members, 150 of them wrote last year, that finally members of Congress, upon request, for the particular chapter, can have a government administration official bring them a chapter, their staff is thrown out of the room, they can't take detailed notes, they're not supposed to talk about what they saw, and they can, without staff to help them figure out what the technical language is, look at a chapter. This is in contrast to, say, even what the Bush administration did. The last time we had one of these mega NAFTA expansion attempts was the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And in that instance, in 2001, that whole draft text was released to the public by the U.S. government on the official government websites. So this is extraordinary secrecy, and members of Congress aren't supposed to tell anyone what they've read. So for instance, Alan Grayson was one of the guys who helped get the text released. Alan Grayson said, I can tell you it's very bad for the future of America. I just can't tell you why. That's obscene. This would rewrite wide swaths of our laws. And again, it's mainly not about trade. So if we have this agreement in effect, for instance, it would be a big push for fracking. Now you would say, why fracking? Because it doesn't allow us to have bans on liquid natural gas exports. Or if this were in effect, we couldn't ensure the safety of the food we feed our families. We have to import, for instance, fish and shrimp that we know from the limited inspection that's done is extremely dangerous from certain kinds of growing ponds that are contaminated, etc., in some of the TPP countries. Or, for instance, some of the financial reforms where the banksters are finally regulated would be rolled back. All of this, and it would be privately enforceable by certain foreign corporations.
Let me ask you about a bill that didn't make it through Congress, but the question is it incorporated into TPP? And that's SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act. First, explain what it is and talk about where it fits in here.
So the Stop Online Piracy Act was a vehicle basically to take away some of our rights on the internet. It would have criminalized what they call inadvertent small-scale non-commercial copying. And the example would be, for instance, one, I had you over to dinner, you liked the recipe I had, I happened to have taken it for $2, I paid for it off of a paid website. And you said, Lori, can you send me that recipe? And of course, I said, yeah, I sent it to you. That is officially a copyright violation. I should say you have to go pay $2 and get it yourself, Lon. But in fact, it's small scale, I didn't sell it, it's not commercial, I didn't send it to a lot of people. That kind of activity under SOPA, as well as any number of things we do all the time. Making a copy, or like a buffer copy that our computer would make to look at a video, or breaking a digital lock. For instance, if we bought software but we wanted to run it on Linux, all of those things would be considered criminal activities. We'd face huge fines, and our carriers, Google, etc., would have to take us off of service to black us out. So a huge limit on internet freedom. That whole mess was defeated in Congress in a wonderful citizen uprising. A chunk of that is now stuck in the copyright chapter of SOPA, of TPP. So they call TPP son of SOPA. And in a lot of countries around the TPP region, citizens have fought to have good laws that actually provide them access and don't allow that kind of control. So that is a chunk. To give you an idea of how varied the problems are, that's a chunk of what is in there. Now, the thing about that fast track you mentioned, fast track is not in effect. Fast track is an extraordinary delegation of Congress's authority. So if we don't want unsafe food, offshore jobs, SOPA limits on internet freedom, the banksters getting rolled back into deregulation, we have to make sure that Congress actually maintains its constitutional authority to make sure that before this agreement can sign, it actually works for us. Fast track's a delegation of authority. President Obama's asked for it, but it only happens if Congress gives it to it.
And Lori, what's been the Obama administration's position on these negotiations in terms of tobacco? Could you talk about that specifically?
Well, the whole approach of the Obama administration has really been, I don't know, some combination of heartbreaking and infuriating. Because when he was a candidate, President Obama promised he would replace the NAFTA model. And instead, they've doubled down. So the tobacco issue is one of those that's the most gruesome. So the TPP includes the very controversial investor-state system, which empowers individual corporations to directly sue governments, not in our courts, but in extrajudicial tribunals where 3 corporate attorneys act as judges, and these guys rotate between being the judge and being the guy suing the government for the corporation. They're empowered to give unlimited cash damages from us, the taxpayers, to these corporations for any government action, a regulatory issue, environment, health, safety, that undermines the investor's expected future profits. Under that system, big tobacco companies have been attacking health regulations, and famously, infamously, these kinds of investor-state cases have extracted billions of dollars and undermined important laws. So Philip Morris has used this to attack Australia, one of the TPP countries, plain packaging of cigarette laws. So a lot of the TPP countries are very worried that they would be basically handcuffed from being able to regulate for health around tobacco. So the U.S. originally was going to offer an exception. Big Tobacco came in and basically won the day. The U.S. pulled away what was a medium exception, put in something that's really worse than nothing. And then Malaysia came in and actually offered a real exception, which the U.S. is opposing. Just like the U.S. is opposing an exception to maintain financial regulations for prudential reasons. Just like the U.S. is opposing a real exception to those investor tribunals with respect to health and the environment. It's incredibly depressing. The only good news is a bunch of the other countries have basically said, basta, we are not going to roll back these things. So the reason there isn't a deal is because a lot of the other countries are standing up to the worst of these U.S. corporate-inspired demands. You can see the whole lay of this at Expose the TPP, www.expose the TPP. There are fact sheets on each of the ways, each aspect of your life that TPP could affect. And if you want to get down into the weeds and have long papers explaining and or information from other countries, you can go to tradewatch.org. That's tradewatch.org. Between those two sets of information, you'll see there's almost no part of your life or the things you care about that this agreement couldn't undermine. And again, trade's the least of it.
Lori Wallach, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Lori Wallach is Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. When we come back, President Obama is about to hit a new milestone. 2 million people
Yeah. Right.
You want the lights on?
Yes. Thank you, Andy. Eric, if you will.
Sure.
And the only thing I have to say to proceed this is we are going to ask people to keep their questions or their comments to under 2 minutes. Okay? And I will, if you're approaching that, I will raise my hand. Okay? So we're going to try to keep, so everybody has a chance to say what they want to say.
I guess the first thing I might get into is, what about these tribunals we just heard about? Pact for real? Individual corporations suing the United States government for unlimited damages and getting judgments against our country or our corporations suing them. There are, under existing trade deals, including the WTO agreement, already international tribunals that deal with trade. Ordinarily, it's governments that are the parties to these cases, but I'll give you a couple of examples of cases that actually have been brought. One against the United States was brought, I believe, by Antigua and Barbuda, which had a number of offshore gambling sites. The United States government regulated internet gambling within the United States, and they also regulated the ability of offshore companies to do gambling business with U.S. residents. That was viewed by some of the countries that hosted these sites as a violation of international trade. That was taken to the WTO, and they won. The United States lost. Now, I think it was Alan that came up with a good question. Well, so what if they lose? Why are we going to pay them? Now, the way that it works in the WTO, and this is the way it already works under the WTO. This isn't what's being proposed here, and what's being proposed has some novel aspects to it. The way it works with the WTO is that the winning company gets to violate some international trade rights of the losing country. In that case, Antigua and Barbuda gets a certain number of $1 billion worth of intellectual property of U.S. companies that they just get. They can say, we're going to dole it out to certain companies in Antigua and Barbuda, and you can violate this many billions of intellectual property. You just go ahead and pirate it and export it any place you want. So that's the penalty in the United States. Now, are there other ways? Let's say that we have a money damages judgment. This is a novel thing. Let's say you have a judgment for money damages against the U.S. government. U.S. Congress says, we're not going to appropriate the money, we're not going to pay it. What can they do? Does anybody have ideas? What can they do?
Well, what we do is we seize the bank accounts of the countries here in New York, but I don't know how much money we have in bank accounts overseas.
Well, bank accounts are one kind of asset. Does the United States government itself have assets in TPP prospective countries? Do we have high-tech military weapons in Japan? In Australia?
You're suggesting they're going to take our battleship?
They can seize any property.
Oh, no, they can't.
They can seize any property.
They want us out of there, too.
And you can think about any other assets the United States has in those countries. What are we going to do? Go to war?
They try to take a battleship, I think so.
Battleship may be a little... I wouldn't... If I were seizing the property, battleship's probably a little bit more than the judgment's worth.
And
so
what good's it going to do you? You would rather seize something that you can, turn into money. If I'm a drug addict, I'm going to steal your stereo because I can sell the stereo and get money and buy drugs. And where can I sell a battleship?
Anyway, Al and I were being picky about the balance. You
No, I-
made a good point. I'm sorry I got you off.
I'm willing to bet that the avionics in some of our cruise missiles, for example, just one cruise missile, what could it hurt? The avionics in there are worth a whole bunch of money, because what we were talking about before, the intellectual property and a bunch of things that we've kept secret from other countries. So, yeah, they're great targets to seize. And there are other strategies to use too. Plus, if we were not to pay such a judgment, that would be for the first time since the War of 1812 that we've defaulted on an obligation or debt of the United States. And how would the financial markets react to that? So, these are real issues. Go ahead.
So it sounds like the TPP is having at least two major effects. One is eroding our sovereignty as a country, and the other is that it is taking corporations, and instead of having them being entities created by government, they're becoming quasi-governments, because they can sue other major governments directly. And so the country is, national governments are kind of declining in their authority, and corporations are gaining rights that they never had before.
I think that's fair. I mean, looking back at history,
at some point we'll just have companies as countries, and countries are just subordinate to companies.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
We're almost there.
Yeah. Well,
One world government.
I actually saw an article by Allen recently talking about history going back to the Roman Empire.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if they had, prototype corporations back then, but if we look at the long scope of history, would it be fair to say that there might have been sort of a seesaw going back and forth? Sometimes corporations getting more powerful after they became widespread, and sometimes governments pushing back and saying, well, there are things that we're not going to let corporations do. Would that be a fair way to look at it, or is it all just one way?
No, I think, corporations pushed back. We had the antitrust laws passed in the governments pushed back.
Yeah.
We had the antitrust laws passed in the 19th century.
Is it an appropriate thing for governments, national governments, sometimes to do, to push back and say, there's some things we just won't let corporations do?
Yes, sir.
No.
Well, you can't do that because they're considered individuals.
Well,
no, they're not. They're considered persons. There's a difference.
Well, I mean, governments regulate us as persons all the time, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, as long as you have
I'm just
national
trying to
authority.
bring up that
Sure.
they're, meshing, it says meshing the importance who holds the power between, you're talking about individuals, governments, and then you're talking about corporations being more powerful and that. And so everybody's in there trying to manipulate the position where they control the others. And so personally, my job is to maintain or go out and fight for individuals to have control of the governments, and the governments to have control of everything else that would come through and affect me as an individual. I mean, we're in a struggle, and we're debating these different conflicting interests. And this thing here, of course, I mean, the ones that are supporting all this, they're on this list here, and these are the people that know the details. And they're the ones that we don't know the details. In fact, sounds like we have a hard time even trying to get them. So.
Many of the participants in the negotiations, the companies that are on the committees that advise the U.S. government on how to negotiate this deal,
right.
Yes, have a particular perspective on that. Mm-hmm. Looking at both sides from the materials you've seen, the video, and what are people's understandings of how this alters the existing balance, such as it is, between the power of corporations and the power of governments to keep corporations in check? Anybody?
Well, I have
Go ahead.
I have more of a question in a different direction, because our lakes are very important to us.
Yes.
So how much power will the World Court have over our lakes if the rest of the world needed water? Or if we decided to, Halliburton, who's on the list of wanting this, wanted to frack around our lakes, whether I disagree or agree with it, how much power does the World Court have to step in and say, well, fracking's good for the whole world, just because you guys don't want it, too bad, for Michigan?
Okay. That's a good question. Let me reframe it a little bit, and we'll come back to the other question I asked. So you asked, how much power does the World Court have? Now, the World Court exists, it's a different body than the WTO, and it's going to be a different situation than with the TPP. So there are actually several multinational tribunals. There's a tribunal under NAFTA already. That cases get brought in that's different than the World Court.
I guess I'm asking about a court that's going to oversee this.
Yeah, the World Court deals with violations of international law by nation states. So Nicaragua sued the United States in the World Court and won because of our mining of harbors in Nicaragua. The World Court probably wouldn't do much about the Great Lakes unless we were to violate international law with respect to Canada.
I think what I'm asking you is the question of the thing we're establishing here. How much power do they have?
What is being proposed, to the best of our understanding from leaked documents, would be a tribunal that, for the first time, instead of the governments going in, would let individual companies, would let Halliburton sue the United States government for something that they think violate the rights. And do we have examples of cases that are somewhat similar to your fracking question? Probably the biggest thing being talked about back when I was studying international trade in law school. Have I already used up all my time? No. Okay. So was what's called the tuna dolphin case. And in that case, the United States wasn't focused on international trade when they passed some laws about keeping dolphins safe in the oceans. And what they said is, yes, the United States is a huge consumer of tuna. There are two kinds of nets. There are nets that scoop up everything and that are very efficient in collecting tuna. But they also collect all the dolphins, and none of the dolphins can escape. And that turns out to be cratering dolphin populations. The United States said, unless you catch it with the nets that aren't as efficient with the tuna, but also let the dolphins out, you can't bring it into the United States. But we lost that one. That, it turned out, in the eyes of some, was actually a trade barrier. It was a trade barrier to countries that let people catch with the bad nets. Then the United States came up with a labeling requirement. We lost that one too. It was a trade barrier. So what you're talking about very well could be viewed by Halliburton as a trade barrier.
And the cases you just described that the U.S. lost, the venue was what?
That was a prototype dispute resolution tribunal before the WTO agreement. So these decisions, it was under something called GATT. Now,
General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade.
General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Back right at the close of World War II, when the Bretton Woods monetary system was put together, the World Bank was put together. The third part of that system was supposed to be a World Trade Organization. And the negotiations didn't get as far as setting up a WTO. We couldn't get enough agreement on that. But what we did do is come up with a stopgap measure that was called the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and let us start getting some experience on a global trade regime.
Didn't they pass the WTO in the 1990s, though?
1995.
Yeah.
So I graduated from law school in 93, 2 years before the WTO came into place. These cases were already being litigated. Tuna dolphin was the thing that everybody was talking about. Because it was so exciting for the people negotiating GATT to say, oh, we can do a whole lot more with these trade agreements. We can do a whole lot more with NAFTA. We can do a whole lot more with WTO than just lower tariffs. We can have what are called TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property protections. where we have uniform intellectual property laws, or more uniform all around the world, which generally means that on existing works that people have already been incentivized to create, what we're going to do is just give them a windfall in terms of extra years to collect on the copyright monopoly. Do they need that extra incentive if they've already created it? Doubtful. Well, we extended copyright terms.
Are the tribunals quasi-government jurisdictions, or are they entirely private? Are they moving in the direction of quasi-governmental to purely private?
Well, the agreements.
What is the nature of these tribunals and the authority?
The authority is the agreement itself, and the authority to have the agreement in place is governmental authority. It's through the agreement of multiple governments.
When a case is brought, is it tried in is the tribunal a private?
The tribunal is whatever the agreement says the tribunal is. Okay, so there is an international agreement that sets up the world court, and there you have professional judges that serve for a term of years, and their job is to be independent judges.
And how are they selected?
I don't want to speculate about that. I should know your answer, but you're drilling down pretty well. But there is set up an independent selection process as well. In other cases, you can have professional arbitrators that get selected. One that I've had a lot of experience with has to do with the World Intellectual Property Organization in Switzerland, which set up its own tribunal without any international agreement to support it in relation to internet domain names. And how did that get populated? Well, there are a few dispute resolution providers that were recognized as providers. What do? They got attorneys, very much like me, who spend their lives representing companies that have famous trademarks. And these attorneys just got recognized, and one of their side jobs is also to act as arbitrators and decide these cases. And guess how the cases turn out? 99, 98% of the time. Against the individual that isn't the big copyright owner or big trademark owner. So the National Arbitration Forum, which is one of the biggest participants in that system, also resolves an awful lot of credit card disputes. And guess how the credit card disputes tend to turn out? And judges that don't decide the right way in the National Arbitration Forum, these are mostly retired judges. They've been elected before, but now they're retired in private practice. They understand if they don't decide enough of the cases the right way, they don't get the regular income stream because they're paid on a case-by-case basis.
They won't be hired in the future.
They won't be hired for more cases. So, yeah, the people that are designing this agreement, they know all this stuff. They've seen it work before. Now, that's also not to say that they're I'm not going to say they're all bad people. I think I sent an email around before. A friend of mine, Tom Wilner, that I worked on the printing presses case that follows the printing presses for the Washington Post. He was representing a German manufacturer, I was representing Japanese. But this is the guy, does anybody know Boumediene versus Bush? Or Rasul versus Bush? Those were the two key cases on Guantanamo. So what a lot of the International Trade Bar does is they do these tremendously boring, super expensive trade cases because that keeps the lights on and pays the bills. And what they're really fascinated with is promoting human rights by saying, yes, the constitutional right to habeas corpus applies to people that have been abducted and taken to Guantanamo. So people in Guantanamo, because of Tom Wilner's work, that he is able to do pro bono because he does these trade cases, That's why that case got in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. That's why they have the constitutional right to habeas corpus. So I don't want to. I don't want to. It's more complicated than just saying they're good guys and bad guys. Okay. Go ahead.
Is there any stopping the fast track way of getting this accomplished?
Well, there is no fast track right now. Congress has to pass a fast track authorization in order for trade promotion authority to kick in. It's not automatic right now. So there has to be a vote by Congress before it can be fast tracked. And that's why Debbie Stabenow at least is saying, I'm not for the fast track. Let's talk about amendments. Let's look under the hood and find out what's going on in this thing.
Are there some recent cases where Congress has granted fast track authority to presidents that we could look at and look at the results of?
I guess I'm not sure how it turned out, but the Free Trade Association for the Americas would be the last time that there would be a discussion in Washington about whether to fast track. Do you know?
No, I was just going to say that the Constitution gives the President the authority to negotiate treaties, and then it's up to the Senate to adopt it or up or down. So we've had a fast track built into the Constitution since 1787 or 88. That's the way treaties are done. Now, comment on it, but
well, that's how treaties are done.
Yeah. Well, it's just not a treaty.
Yeah, fast track is different than treaty ratification under the U.S. Constitution, because what Congress does is they voluntarily relax the rules, and they say we're going to give the House a say in this too, and you just need a 50% majority vote in both the House and the Senate, and then this becomes law. That's how fast track works. It bypasses the ordinary advice and consent of the Senate, which requires 2/3 of senators to approve a treaty. So it makes it easier to get what's equivalent to a treaty in place as law of the United States. So fast track is clever.
But Congress is not giving up anything, because if they vote for the fast track, they can still vote down the bill.
They can.
Yeah.
They can.
Up or down.
But then it's an up or down vote on the entire package.
Yeah.
No amendments by America allowed, because it's an up or down on a package negotiated between all these multiple nations.
But there's two levels of sovereignty that they are not surrendering. One is to decide to whether to have a fast track, and the second is to whether to comply with the fast track. Because they can vote to have a fast track and still adopt the thing with amendments if they want to. I mean, Congress can bring its own rules.
They can. We'll see if they do it. And remember,
Well, I say this: I don't think the fast track is the evil. The evil is in the details you're talking about.
right? I'm just trying to report that this is what fast track does, and that's why it's different than what the Constitution says. I'm not saying that the Constitution is the only way to do it. Nor would I suggest that it's illegitimate or against the law or against the Constitution to do a fast track if Congress chooses to do that. That's what Congress gets to decide. Now, if you're an individual member of Congress and you've got to go out and spend, 70-80% of your time actually raising funds rather than writing legislation, what are the incentives once you've got fast track in place? And remember, the incentive for members of Congress isn't just the money that you can raise, but it's kind of like an iceberg. So the money that you can raise is the tip of the iceberg, but below the waterline, that's the money that your opponent is going to raise if you don't toe the line. That same company that's giving $1,500 to you, they're going to put $500,000 against you if you don't do what you want. It's the money that they don't spend. It's scary.
What is the rationale for fast track? Why would I want my government to do that?
Well, the main rationale for fast track would be if we put amendments on this thing, then we're not ratifying the thing that the president negotiated. And that's going to scuttle the deal for everybody because all the other negotiating partners have done this very delicate deal. And if we try to amend it up right now, we're never going to be able to go back to them and get them to agree to the same thing. So it's the coordination problems. That's why fast track. That's why proponents of fast track say this makes a lot of sense. We couldn't get any trade deals.
But this would normally apply to something that's already been in the news and the paper. We know about what this agreement is, isn't it?
What's that, fast track?
No, not, the normal justification for using fast track is what you said, so because we've made these agreements with other nations.
Right.
Think we know about that normally?
It's possible.
You mean
It's possible.
No.
Right now, we're blind to the contract.
Well, it's possible once the negotiation process is done. And if you look at the notes, I've gone through the intellectual property section of this mostly, which is the part that the most details have leaked about. There are huge points of contention between some of the negotiating parties. Okay? New Zealand and we don't see eye to eye on a whole lot. Some of the South American countries, Mexico, don't see things the way that we do, especially on intellectual property. There's going to have to be a lot of give and take in order to get this deal done. The reason that it's secret now is that it's hard to do all that give and take if the whole thing's out in the public.
I've seen that. I've read that section. And
right.
The thing of it is, it looked to me like unless you're working in the trenches and you know about international trade, it makes no sense at all. It's just a bunch of generalities. And what does all this mean? Even without all those paragraphs that U.S. proposes.
Yeah, it's probably hard without some familiarity with the field, and this covers a lot of different areas. Yeah. So, you know, one of these big mega firms in Washington and New York City, you've got 1,000 lawyers there, some of whom do just tax. Some of them do just, writing the prospectuses for corporations. Some of them do just lawsuits. Some of them do just trademarks, do just copyrights. And really what you need in order to understand all the working parts of one of these deals, because a trade deal impacts, like they said, 29 different fields. There is an investment component. There is an intellectual property component. In order to understand those, no one individual has all that expertise. To understand it, you need 1,000 lawyers in a building. Each one can explain this moving part to the other one, and everybody can sort of understand enough of the whole. It's a really complicated thing. Go ahead.
Getting back to the topic of tribunals and corporations suing the U.S. government, back in the 90s, I'm pretty sure this was like mid-90s, there was another trade agreement proposed, which I believe it failed at least the first time around. Elements of it may have ended up in subsequent agreements. So it was called the MAI, the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. And one of the provisions of that was that corporations could sue the U.S. or other countries that were parties to the agreement if we restricted some kind of business or investment activity on their part, which and they could sue us based on the loss of future profits.
It appears to be.
Is that an element of this?
It looks like that's being recycled. Yes.
Great.
Yeah. I remember one case. I'm going to try not to provide too many details, but it involved a company with very investment intensive. They had a lot of assets on the ground. Had invested in a South American company, and that South American company regulated their fixed assets on the ground in a way that was very unprofitable for them. They come to this Washington law firm, they say, we want you to scour every treaty, every agreement, anything. We don't like how it's turned out for us in the national courts of this country. Find a way for us to fix this. We want our money back. That happens all the time. And this would give them a vehicle. In that case, what they should have done, there was already something called ICSID, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, that if they and that country, when they were initially making that investment in South America, if they said, well, we all agree to an ICSID arbitrator to decide, if there is a problem with regulation or expropriation, then ICSID can appoint arbitrators to decide it. They didn't sign on to such a thing. So I'm not sure how that all turned out, but it was a fascinating case, and a lot of brainstorming on how to fix that problem. So let's go back. I think Andy can make the generic case for why international trade is a good thing.
Oh, yeah. I have no trouble with that.
Sure.
I'm just not sure that this TPP is a good thing. But trade is where we get wealthy. I just want you to think of two communities. One on the seashore trading with its neighbors and foreigners and such, and one sitting in inland in a mountaintop with a wall around it. Which one is going to be a richer community? Well, obviously the one that trades. The richest, the fastest growing and richest communities around the world, Hong Kong, people are poor, some of them, but the community came up from nothing to pretty good wealth very fast because of free trade. Singapore, it become very rich because of free trade, and Taiwan and South Korea. I think instead of adopting these agreements, what the United States Congress ought to do is take the agreement it would like to have and just pass a law and say this is the law in the United States. And then you don't have anybody else being able to enforce it because it's just the United States law. I think that this idea that we only want to have fair trade and we have to protect the American worker and all that does is make the rest of us poorer. That's the pitch for free trade.
Okay, I can probably add a few things to that pitch for free trade. So another thing you want to think about is comparative advantage. So the one community that's on the seashore might harvest coconuts really well, and you can't do that very well in the mountains, but the mountaintop may be really good miners. So if the miners trade with the coconut farmers, both can be better off because each can specialize in doing the thing that they do best. And what international trade, at least in theory, lets us do is lets everybody specialize more or less in what they do best, and then profit by being able to trade back and forth. Now, I'm not sure about the idea about just sort of unilaterally giving up all our protective tariffs if we're dealing with a trading partner who wants to get all the advantages of being able to participate in our market but doesn't give us any corresponding benefit in terms of trade.
My answer to that is, it's like if you say, well, we're going to keep tariffs until you get rid of your tariffs. It's like we're going to keep hitting ourselves in the head until you stop hitting yourself in the head. Because the tariffs hurt our people even if the other countries have tariffs. Our tariffs hurt our people. Hong Kong, Singapore didn't wait until they had tariff agreements. They just had free trade.
Okay. We might want to be a little bit more specific and say a tariff that, say, protects the steel industry or protects lumber producers. I mean, the lumber and steel cases are the really huge cases in Washington where everybody gets a little chunk of lumber. They just go on for years. But yeah, if you protect steel workers or people that cut down trees, that may help them while the protectionism is in place. But what if you're a home builder and you like to get less expensive lumber from Canada? That's not good for the home builders. So yeah, there is an argument that just like monopolization creates a deadweight loss because you restrict supply in order to increase price, and you can do all the graphs on it, there's a pretty good argument to be made for an economist that yes, everybody is worse off when we have tariffs. Now, why is the TPP different?
You just explained it. A lot of things is different about it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's different is we already have trade agreements with most of these countries, and the tariffs are already zero. The deadweight loss of the tariff has already been eliminated. this isn't about reducing tariff barriers. What it's really about is doing a lot of things that relate to other agendas. It's the banks writing the laws that they wish they had and then saying everybody in the world has to have these laws rather than the ones that the Congress has passed. It's about the 7 companies that own most of the music in the world and all of the movies. You know, all the movies. Saying these are the laws that we would really like to have every place. And even though we couldn't even get the U.S. Congress to pass SOPA, which is a terrible law, let's backdoor it through this trade agreement. Now, I'm also not sure that I always buy those graphs on supply and demand that economists show, because they always make some assumptions. You know, they make sure, they assume that everybody's really well informed, that everybody's just rational. They always act in their self-interest. I go, you haven't spent a lot of time. Just spend an afternoon down at the Muskegon County Courthouse and ask yourself whether those assumptions are all true.
Well, that's a straw man, you knocked down measures.
Yeah,
I wasn't asserting any of those things.
No, I understand, but that's what the economics graphs, you have to presuppose all of that stuff.
Not mine.
So, okay. So, yes, in theory it should work that way. Yes, I'm actually persuaded by the argument. You don't want to hurt the home builders in order to benefit the lumberjacks. I think that's a persuasive argument. But it's probably a little bit more complicated than the graphs, too. Go ahead.
Are you aware of anything other than the SOPA provisions that they're trying to backdoor through this monstrosity?
Well, I think you just described a tribunal is very similar to what they're describing now.
Specifics that have been
Right,
rejected in the past.
and then the trade-related investment measures are likely to be very similar to the alternatives to, you know, Sarbanes-Oxley that the banking industry has passed. I don't know for sure about that. But I know that the third-hand sources that I'm listening to say, yeah, there's really bad investment stuff in there. Go ahead.
Are they having things in there about labeling? You mentioned something. We can't label our tuna dolphin free under that, or they might have something like that.
Well, I think the resolution of that ultimately became that consumer demand gave a commercial advantage to companies that still use the labeling.
Yeah.
It just wasn't required by the government.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's a good Cato Institute argument.
I would think so, yeah.
That the free market sometimes accomplishes what the government can't.
But is it possible that this thing would restrict what manufacturers or companies could put on their label because it would somehow be unfair competition? Like American beef or something like that?
There are already some restrictions under the WTO agreement on origin labeling. Because origin labeling is viewed as a restriction on trade, I wouldn't be surprised if this further restricts origin labeling. The thing that's most concerning, though, and if you see Monsanto on the list of sponsors, they really don't want GMO labeling anywhere. They really don't want GMO labeling. They don't want people to know whether there's GMO in their product. Exactly.
So this
Speculation on my part whether that will be in there. Don't be surprised if GMO labeling is out everywhere, at least within the TPP if it's passed. Go ahead.
So all those rules for GMO labeling that are in Europe are in effect now in Europe could be wiped out by something that has to do with trans.
Yeah, the TPP, none of the countries that would sign on to TPP, none of them are European.
I know that. That's what I'm asking. So it wouldn't affect.
It wouldn't affect Europe at all.
But if there are countries in the Pacific Rim countries that are negotiating parties in this agreement that have passed GMO labeling laws, then I think what you're saying is true.
No, if in order to comply with European law, a European company had GMO labeling on a product and tried to export it to the United States and didn't remove the GMO labeling, it's entirely possible that might affect the company to the extent it's doing exports to the United States. But again, I'm getting into speculative speculation right now. I don't know for sure because we don't have a clear understanding of what all is in the agreement. Go ahead.
These trade agreements are laws. They are laws. And over time, laws need to be maintained. Because if the majority of the population in each of the countries that is involved decide that they want to have GMO labels, but yet the trade agreement says they can't do it, there needs to be a mechanism. Okay, who reviews these laws and tries to update them and maintain them and be current with the wishes of the populations of the individual countries that signed on?
The whole point is to remove that mechanism.
I get that.
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm going to assume that the motives are always that way, but
how about 80% of the time?
It is hard with a trade agreement. It is hard to negotiate a trade agreement.
It's like
usually what we do. Now we did have bilateral investment treaties with both Mexico and Canada. We did update the law with NAFTA.
Okay.
I don't know if that was a result of a groundswell of ordinary Americans saying we really need a NAFTA.
No.
I don't remember the grassroots support for that myself, but perhaps you do.
But those laws become solidified. They become kind of like constitutions. They become very difficult to change.
They are very difficult.
Where there are a lot of details that we might want to be able to revise and change. So what it really says is that we need some kind of global legislative body that somebody elects people to so they can review these things and modify them over time as circumstances change.
Well, that sounds like a provocative argument. Let's hear from the folks that say U.S. sovereignty, European sovereignty, South American sovereignty. We shouldn't have a global legislature. Can somebody make that argument?
Oh, I don't. You can't have a global. In my view, you can't have a global legislature until you have people that we trust around the world. Democracy doesn't work unless you have a mutual respect to some extent and a willingness to accept the results of it. And with a global thing, I wouldn't want any
legislators.
Pardon me?
First, before we can trust.
I wouldn't trust any world government that came out of the countries of this world.
So what that says is that we can't trust these negotiators for the trade agreement either.
Agreed.
And allegiances change.
We shouldn't have these trade agreements until we get people in place to negotiate them who we trust.
Well, I'm not sure we should ever have these trade agreements.
Now, many historians and advocates for trade will then turn around and point out the single best thing during the course of the 20th century and also in the 21st century to promote that level of trust between countries, to be able to come together, is the trade and commerce that we've been able to develop as a result of these kinds of agreements.
Yeah.
So this is the mechanism to create that trust. Go ahead.
Then you have to have a mechanism that provides for public input. And I would say I completely agree with the views that we should not have any kind of global legislature. And there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons is I think that as the bigger a country gets, the more difficult it becomes to govern. And some of the countries that are doing a much better job now of where the governments are representing public interest much better are smaller countries, for example, Iceland. And I think the United States is at a point now where it's very difficult for the government to represent the values of the citizens and to take steps towards some kind of global legislative body to solve the problem we're talking about tonight is the worst possible thing we can do. And I think that the most powerful players that are behind the TPP, that's exactly what they want because they will control that process.
Okay. Let's talk about the transparency issue. Is there anybody here who thinks that the difficulty of the negotiating process in setting up something like the TPP justifies the level of secrecy? Is there anything? All right.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
Because people are sensationalists. The press is sensationalist. If they negotiated the public, the press, and I'm not talking about any particular part of the press, just all of them, would pick out the juicy points of negotiation and write a story on it and get us all exercised over something that might have just been a trial balloon that no one really expected to go anyplace. But Congress should not vote on it until we've had a chance to see it, until they've had a chance to read it. And you would think, well, that's obvious until you remember how the Patriot Act came into view or place, and how the Affordable Care Act came into place. And then just in the last couple of months, the budget agreement, all these things were passed without anybody in Congress having read them. So, yeah, that ought to be public before they pass it, but I think the negotiations have got to be private.
All right, does anybody disagree with that point of view? Go ahead.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
All right, so tell us why. What's your reason?
In other words, the assumption there is that the normal person is not informed enough and not smart enough to weigh in on it. And secrecy is done. I think that's always, to me, is for the claim is that, well, people we can't, it'd be too sensationalized. And we can't allow, we put out this, and that's true. It's all a matter of trust, and trust comes about by association and communications, so forth, and everything is
Should we make a distinction between secrecy from the general public and secrecy from our legislators or representatives who are supposed to be evaluating these things? I mean,
that could
right,
sure, yeah, that could be right. That's fine.
Keep it secret.
That's
from
fine.
the broad general public, but you don't want to keep it secret from our legislators and our legislative staffs and the attorneys and the people who we should be able to evaluate this in depth.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what about the sensational press argument? Let's say that we've had some agreements in the past where we didn't have this level of secrecy and we managed to get those through. Does that suggest that was the press any less sensational then?
Sensationalism is relative, but I hope press would inform the public who the public then would make a judgment as to whether or not it is quote-unquote sensationalism or a scare tactic.
A lot of us have decreased confidence in the integrity of certain aspects of the press.
The fourth estate fails us many times.
At the same time, sensationalism in the press is a relative concept. I would argue that there are times when it can be good. For example, in the case of the Patriot Act, I think we could have used a lot of press sensationalism before that got rammed down our throats.
In some cases, you need not to have the press, because look at Syria. We might have been able to work a deal to get the chemical weapons out. Instead, the press gets hold of it. It's everywhere, and people just say, we ain't going there. But we have to have Russia step in to take care of it for us. So the press can be overwhelming to you, and sometimes you have to work deals in secret, I believe. But once the deal's out, you can't fast track it too. I mean, that's a whole different ballgame. We all should know what we're getting into. But you start out the deal, even in my business, you start out the deal between you and whoever's hiring you or whatever.
Well, your business is different than a government, a democracy, excuse me. Your business is different than a democracy. The democracy, the core concept of democracy is transparency.
No, it is, but when you start a deal, you have to start somewhere, and then you work it out, and then you put it before the people.
You can do that in your company.
You can do that in real life. I don't see how this nation is never going to agree 100% on anything. So you're going to have Fox News going in one direction and CNN going another. And there's no way. So you're going to have half this country automatically all upset over anything that happens. So you have to work something out and bring it to the people.
You're making a strong argument that people will be upset over getting news. A whole lot of people. Not necessarily. You're assuming then that the American public is not rational, and I defy you that is not a rational argument.
Let me propose another couple of things to consider in terms of the transparency or openness of the negotiating process. How about an in-between situation? Let's say we come up with an approach where let me start first with this one. So we see this list of companies that are able to advise the United States government on what ought to be in this trade deal. What if they also open it up? Swear everybody to secrecy as long as the negotiations are on. We need to get an agreement before we're going to release it to the public and let everybody comment. But for right now, let's also have input from some well-informed public interest organizations too.
College professors.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Who studies trade. College professors. People who spend their lives thinking about this stuff.
Or some of the people that are around us that are now opposed.
What's that? Go ahead.
I don't like it.
All right, why not?
Because who picks out what public interest organization? There's a lot of smart people out there who don't belong to public interest organizations, who could make a real contribution to the public's understanding of what's in this thing. If it were released to them, if those people had it. And if you worry about people that are particularly sophisticated and we're going to raise a bunch of sand, but that's democracy. And these people aren't necessarily wrong. If there are things in this thing about, for instance, getting rid of burdens to trade, are they talking about what? Union organizing? We don't know. They could be.
Let's focus on the choice between a limited list of advisors, a slightly bigger list of advisors, and then having all the experts in the world be potential advisors. And I think you're arguing that all the experts in the world being potential advisors way outweighs the risk of the sensational press argument. Would that be a fair way to summarize it?
I think so.
Does anybody else agree with that?
Or
Bruce, go
putting
ahead.
it just a slightly different way, an antidote to concealment or to sensationalism is to have an open public dialogue, because although one fellow might sell more newspapers one day by screaming and jumping up and down, the other newspaper says, well, wait a minute, let's look at all the issues, let's have an editorial board examine them, let's have a panel, let's do a weekly series where we fill a half a page a day for a whole week and explain to the public over 5 or 6 days what more depth is about this, so that a week later, what was sensational on day one has become part of a broader, open, I believe, more desirable dialogue, more democratic with a small d, and more conducive ultimately to a wiser set of decisions than that first jump up and down and yell sensationalism type of report. If that was the case, then Madonna would never be able to sell any records, because she first took off her blouse in public and sang in that manner. No, she's still out selling records and making movies. The sensationalism didn't carry the day.
Well, I think that's a fair argument. To sort of condense it down, I'd say this is a short attention span argument. So to be fair to the U.S. public, yet, and to be really fair with them, yes, there are people who are susceptible to sensationalism. No question about it. But for how long are they really susceptible to that sensationalism? Don't they forget pretty quickly? Go ahead.
The conversation the last few minutes have been along the lines of whether secrecy is necessary in this process, and obviously you can make a case for and against. Whether or not the press should report, obviously we can make a case that certain segments of the media do a better job than others. But here's a completely different direction to look at the whole issue from, and that is what has happened in the past when such agreements have been negotiated, whether in secret or not. And the answer to that question is it benefits these corporations, usually to the detriment of the middle class. And you can say that happened in the 90s when the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act was passed, which overturned Glass-Steagall. The result was enormously beneficial for Wall Street and catastrophic for the rest of the country. I think you can make similar arguments about NAFTA, GATT, WTO, the humongous wave of corporate mergers we've seen that just receives zero antitrust review. And it comes down to what we're talking about at the beginning of the evening, which is trust and who do our representatives really represent. And it seems to me that the bigger problem than whether or not these things are negotiated in secrecy, because I think you can make a case for secrecy to some extent. But the bigger problem is who do our representatives represent? They don't represent us anymore, and they haven't for a long time, and it's getting worse and worse.
Now, I want to create an opportunity for a stronger sense of that argument to be made, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to persuade Andy to stick around long enough to do this. Does anybody have the view that not only right, but these kinds of deals, like this one, are essentially inevitable?
Well, they've been going on for
why should we be so upset about it? My parents get used to it. Isn't this really inevitable?
No.
Aren't our institutions
not
strong enough?
That's just saying bring on fascism.
Yeah, well, let's get used to it.
I don't think any of these companies are fascist, but I don't want to claim any of them are. But does anybody here want to suggest that this really is inevitable?
No, it shouldn't be.
Okay.
I mean, we shouldn't encourage it. I mean, we should. I mean, if it's inevitable, you're sort of suggesting, well, we shouldn't do anything about it. We can't do anything about it. I mean, which I oppose.
Well,
we have to stop. We're already 15 minutes
Well,
past.
you
This
ended.
is extremely stimulating, good discussion, and to some extent we can go on after we end the meeting if people want to talk individually to each other.
Jay, what about your question at the beginning of the presentation? What can we do as citizens?
Okay, I have a few thoughts. What does anybody else, what can you do if you really support one of these? What can you do to help get it passed? Or if you oppose it, what can you do to help stop it? Anybody have any thoughts?
Contact your congressman and keep this on.
Talk to your representative? I had that one down.
Keep the congressman and keep that.
Anything else that we can do?
Well, those things are happening at a level far above my realm of influence.
Okay. We know that a lot of people don't even know this is happening. Is that correct? There's massive number of people don't even know it's happening. How can we reach out to them?
It takes large numbers. It takes big numbers. That's how SOPA got defeated. Big numbers.
Yeah. And there are some public interest groups that are reaching out and trying to make sure everybody knows about this. As individuals, we can talk to everybody we know. We could start something like a chain letter. You know, one of those things where you send to 10 people and you those 10 people to send to 10 people. There's an idea. You can sign petitions, and there's petitions all over the internet from all these NGOs. You can sign those if you think that does any good.
Is there a synopsis?
It makes me feel better when I sign one, but I'm not sure it does much. Yes.
Is there a synopsis out there that we could use, like they distributed to us and that we've signed up on your list, that then we can turn to go through our contacts and send that out? So we kind of bring it, boil it down to the simple essence of what it is.
Depending on which side you're talking about.
But it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
To put it out there. Yeah.
I think you have some synopsis kind of stuff in terms of on the table. You know.
One of my concerns about the synopsis is if you boil it down enough, somebody encountering this for the first time, they just go, I don't believe this would even be possible.
Yeah.
I don't believe it's coming. This seems so out of the realm of what I've ever imagined governments do.
One thing we didn't talk about even was the impact of this on something that most of the people in this room use, and that's prescription drugs. We didn't even touch on that.
In fact, they're going to extend patent terms.
Yeah. So.
What?
Pardon me?
Drugs only remain subject to the patent monopoly for a limited period of time. Yeah, but if you extend out the duration of the patent, then they get the profits of being the only one that can produce that drug for a longer period of time. Now, if they've already been incentivized to create the drug, they've already created the blockbuster drug, what possible need do we have to add an additional incentive to create something that they've already done? What public policy reason is there for that?
To extend the length of their patent protection.
to allowing it to go generic and
because we think it's more important
for a much lower price after the expiration of the patent.
Yeah, so we prefer the shareholders of pharmaceutical companies to save people.
Right.
Okay, I don't understand the public policy reason behind that.
Oh, it's not public, it's private policy.
All right.
It's corporate policy.
To extend, I don't understand the question. To extend, they get so long.
Right.
Yeah, they're the only one that can produce it for so long, and then.
At the end of the patent, then it becomes generic, and anybody can practice that art.
Yeah.
Now, if you extend the duration, that means that only one company can practice the art for the extra duration.
Who's that then?
Which means that supply is restricted during that period of time. You have fewer people that can get the drug, but the pharmaceutical company for those extra 2 years gets a lot more profits.
Yeah. So what's the question? Is that?
I'm just saying that's one of the things that's in this.
Oh, that they can extend the time?
Right. That's one of the things that's in the TPP.
Well,
if you fast track the TPP and Congress votes for it, then this effect happens. I'm just wondering what the public policy reason for it is. I don't have a good answer for that. I'd love to hear somebody who does have an answer for this is why this benefits the general public.
It's for corporations. It's not for us people. It's for corporations.
Yeah.
And that's just one component.
Right. I mean, they get away with changes.
Sorry, I started down. We really do have to end this, and we don't have any fact that you over here, but we do have some other goodies if you'd like to stay around and have individual one-on-ones with
in response to Mr. Collins, I have the name right?
Yes.
Your question, and you did pull together various sources. If you want to provide your email, he can forward to you. Okay. And among those, you would find
your email.
Synopsis. Yeah. More videos. So if you have, you're willing to share your email, they can forward.
Please remember to do your evaluation forms. I appreciate that. Also, if you want to hear about more meetings, be sure to give us your email address and find the cookies.